Welcome to the Close Encounter Club. I'm your host, Justin Gearhart. Tonight's episode is one that I feel honored and a little emotional to share. Dr. Jeff Meldrum, a world-renowned anthropologist, anatomist, and one of the leading scientific voices in the search for Sasquatch, joined me and Josh for a conversation not that long ago. On September 11th, 2025, Dr. Meldrum passed away. Not only was he a brilliant anthropologist and anatomist, but also one of the few scientists willing to step out into the unknown and ask questions most of his colleagues wouldn't touch. His work on Sasquatch footprints and human evolution left an impact on me and many others that will last far beyond his lifetime. What you're about to hear is one of his final recorded conversations. Unfortunately, we couldn't get his camera working on that day, so this will be an audio-only episode. But I think in some ways that makes it even more powerful, because it's just his voice, his ideas, and his passion for the truth. It's not often you get the chance to speak with someone who completely shifts your perspective. I'll be honest, I was never really a believer in Bigfoot, and Dr. Meldrum was the very first person I ever spoke to about Sasquatch on this show, and what an honor it was. This conversation changed my opinion dramatically, and I think by the end of it, those of you that are a little bit skeptical of Bigfoot, you might find yourself looking at the mystery differently too. This is episode 20, and our conversation with the legendary Dr. Jeff Meldrum. And you're listening to the Close Encounter Club.
Well, my name is Jeff Meldrum. I'm a full professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University here in Pocatello, Idaho, where I've been for nearly 33 years now. My teaching emphasis is in the anatomical sciences, particularly human gross anatomy, a very applied sort of clinical-based, case study-based type of anatomy for the allied health professional programs we have here. So graduate level, full body dissection, regional anatomy dissection course. But I also do research then into the vertebrate functional comparative morphology broadly, but most specifically into the evolution of hominin bipedalism, how we came to be adapted to walking on two legs, walking and running on two legs. And as such, I also teach occasionally some courses as an adjunct in the anthro department there, and human evolution and the survey of living primates, etc., those kind of things. So it was that emphasis that really brought me to the topic of Sasquatch. It was the footprint evidence, which was so intriguing and which I had something to offer. So it wasn't just me. I just didn't have, it wasn't me having an experience, seeing a UFO on a night or seeing a Sasquatch on a given day. It was those experiences, some approaching those were to follow, but it was an interest in the prospect of another bipedal hominin and perhaps multiple species on a what's now been recognized as a Bushy phylogenetic tree of hominins and hominoids more broadly, with evidence that some of those species may have persisted into the present time frame.
When Dr. Meldrum says the evolutionary tree is bushy, he means it's not a single straight line from ape to human, but a branchy structure with many species existing at the same time. Yeah, so that was actually one of my first questions was, did you have an interest in Bigfoot and that's what drew you to study anthropology, or was it vice versa? Was it you had an interest in anthropology first, and then you took a turn into Sasquatch?
Right. Well, it's almost a chicken or an egg discussion, because it's hard to dissect apart what was influencing what. So as a youngster, I grew up fascinated from the earliest age with all things natural history. We moved around a lot in different situations, and we often ended up in a home that was close to the edge of town. where there was there were wild stretches to be explored by youngsters back in the days when, you'd grab a sandwich and stick it in a baggie, but the folding top baggies before we had Ziploc,
Yeah.
even, and take off for the day. And mom would say, "We'll be home before dark," and we'd be gone all day. And this, I'm talking grade school years. You can't really imagine doing that these days, but we were exploring and collecting, finding bones, collecting insects. Had terraria and aquaria in my room, and always bringing home stray animals, and had a pet prairie dog for a while. Had all sorts of tried to smuggle a whole grocery sack full of garter snakes into my bedroom when I was in first grade, and things like that. So when word of the Patterson Gimlin film, which was my first exposure, as is the case with so many people my age and younger, somewhat younger, but maybe under different circumstances. But this was one of the inaugural showings of the film to the public in the U.S. was when Roger started, taking his documentary that showcased the film on the road. One of his first stops was nearby Spokane, Washington, where I happened to be residing at that time. So I was at that time about fifth grade, about 11 years old.
I promise I won't interrupt too much more, but for anyone who might not be familiar, the Patterson Gimlin film is a short piece of footage shot in 1967 at Bluff Creek, California. It's the video that you think of when you think of Bigfoot. It shows what appears to be a large, upright, hair-covered figure, now famously known as Patty, striding across a clearing. The film has been studied, debated, and argued over the decades, with some calling it the most important piece of Sasquatch evidence ever captured. To this day, it remains one of the most iconic and controversial images and videos in cryptozoology.
As the kids at school who had seen the advertisement in the paper were describing this, and a couple kids had actually seen the Reader's Digest article had already come out that reprinted a condensed version of, I think it was Argosy was the version they had, either Argosy or True Magazine. I'm not sure which one carried it at that time now. It just seemed to embody all the things that I was fascinated, because, of course, my interest in natural history, I of course, went through the dinosaur age, and so was fascinated by all things prehistoric, including prehistoric man and human evolution, the hominin fossil record. And my brother and I, although our interests didn't always align, when we got interested in something, we really immersed ourselves in it. So, we never collected baseball cards. We never had sports stats, although later my brother did. I mean, his almost savant ability to memorize all of these stats. I mean, I could tell you every dinosaur's scientific name and which period it was found in, and what its specific stats were and so forth. My brother could tell you sports stats, but he was fascinated by aviation, so he could look up and, based on a contrail, tell you the make and model of that aircraft and what its top speed was. And
fascinating. That's cool.
Yeah. And so, my parents were always very supportive and very encouraging when it came to those interests, both of us. And so, we had our World Book Encyclopedia set. We had an International Wildlife Encyclopedia set. We had, of course, the whole Time Life Nature Library series. And, summers were spent trips to the library, bringing home stacks of books and so forth of all different stripes. But anyway, so the point being is there was a predisposition, had sort of prepared the soil for the planting of that seed, and it took off, like Jack's magic beans. It was, it really exploded. Although that interest waxed and waned over the years, I mean, it certainly had an influence and was a lens, at least for a period of time, through which a lot of those interests were focused. And so when it finally came time to select a career path, I actually went to college on a scholarship on a pre-veterinary science back, and had already done my volunteer hours at a local clinic and had gotten to know the veterinarians in the neighborhood and so forth, and was very eager to pursue that. But I hadn't a clue what academia was. And so, not having had any role models in that area, my exposure to the collegiate environment was a real eye-opener for me. I just loved, the campus environment. I loved the seminars and the concerts and symposia and the access to the library. I got to remember this was pre-internet. And so to have a university library right there and all that you could tap into and just the intellectual stimulation of the coursework, taking courses and all these things I was fascinated with vertebrate zoology and human anatomy and so forth. I eventually landed on physical anthropology as the embodiment of so many things I was fascinated with. The anatomy, the primatology, the paleoanthropology, the hominin fossil record, and literally kind of found my way through that process of identifying programs and striking up correspondence with potential faculty mentors and reading their reprints and doing research into what was the cutting edge, what were the real questions of the discipline, and where research was taking place, and so on. And then but at that time the interest in Bigfoot was very, very dormant, and it wasn't until some other events kind of rekindled that curiosity and that interest and further developments and some opportunities that were laid down in my path that afforded me a chance to examine some of this evidence firsthand in the field and in the laboratory. And to get acquainted with some scholars like John Bindernagel and Dr. Grover Krantz and others. But I was in a particularly advantageous position and posture, being so focused on the evolution of hominin bipedalism, and especially the anatomy and the alteration, the evolution of the modern human foot form, the timing and pattern of the process of that emergence of those adaptations. So that when I was out in the field on an occasion and was shown a long line of 14.5-inch tracks, I was one of a handful of academics who were particularly skilled in the evaluation of footprint evidence and fossil footprints as far as the hominin record goes. But in order to understand fossil footprints, a lot of comparative studies looking at other great apes and humans walking in track beds and evaluating comparative basis for interpreting that anatomy. So when I sat there taking in these very, very fresh footprints in the mud, it was extremely impactful, much more significant perhaps to me than the average person who didn't have the depth of understanding and appreciation of what these footprints conveyed, what the story that they told.
Yeah, I'm imagining if I was walking through the woods and I saw that, you're the guy that you would call to analyze that.
Well, that's how it's turned out. Yeah. Whether it's footprints or whether there was a footprint I was just commenting on and evaluating for someone last night, and then this morning someone had contacted me about a forelimb skeleton that they thought could be, according to the local sheriff's office and the coroners and so forth, they concluded it wasn't human, but they didn't know what it was. Well, I took one look at it, and it's probably a dog. It's a canid, a dog coyote. I don't think there are wolves in Kentucky right now, but there might be some. There have been some coy wolves in that region. But anyway, the point being is, I know what I'm looking at. And so not only am I particularly qualified, the word I'm after, particularly qualified to render an opinion, but But that opinion is even more impactful to me personally, as well as I would hope to others who can appreciate the expertise that it's based upon. So when people ask me, what's the most compelling, what's the most persuasive evidence? Well, it's the footprint evidence for me. It's the most pervasive. It's the most prolific thing that we have, other than enigmatic hair samples or inexplicable vocalizations or fleeting glimpses and a few photobomb kind of possible images. The Patterson Gimlin film remains the most iconic image that we have, and I'm quite convinced of its credibility. But it set the bar so high, so early in this. Nothing has ever overtaken it as of yet. Well, the human footprint is characterized by a very distinctive suite of very derived characteristics. We have, in the course of our evolution, humans have greatly reduced the robusticity of our skeleton, including the foot skeleton. And so it is much more, we say, gracile, more slender in build, not as wide for length. We have also, along with that, have very much lessened our muscle mass. So we're much leaner. We're kind of like, it's like comparing a marathon runner to a bodybuilder on steroids. There's tremendous contrast. And of course, that has been, that comparison has been strongly selected for people who are good at running marathons versus people who have subjected their body to unnatural hormone environments that have caused hyperplasia, hypertrophy of muscle mass. But the point being is the hominids naturally, genetically, had a predisposition for heavier body mass, thicker skeletal elements, more robust skeletal elements, and heavier musculature. But with the advent of Homo sapiens, and they've kind of pinned it down, it appears that we have a duplication or two of a gene known as myostatin. Statin means, put the brakes on, and myo refers to muscle. And so this gene, if you knock out this gene in test subjects like mice or beef cattle, they put on massive amounts of muscle. So it seems that we have genetically been selected to be lean, mean running machines. And our feet have adapted to that behavior with the advent of, and it's not just like it happened overnight. There were a lot of sequential kind of mosaic modifications to the foot. But in short, we have a narrower heel, very distinct sole pad under the heel and under the ball of the foot, where the basis of support for a longitudinal arch are found. Our toes are greatly shortened in length, and our big toe has remained quite large by comparison, and our center of mass passes from down the lateral side of the foot medialward to the ball at the base of the big toe, and then the final push-off comes through the toe, the big toe, the hallux, at push-off. That characterizes the human. And I do that because it's important that you have that in mind as you contrast the differences of the Sasquatch foot. You mentioned the mid-tarsal break. By break, we mean an axis of flexion, bending of the foot. And so the mid-tarsus is where, in a human foot, the, quote, instep would be located. The bones just ahead of the heel bone and the ankle bone, which are greatly enlarged in size relative to these other bones. But right in front of the heel and the ankle bone is a pair of joints, which is together referred to as the mid-tarsal joint or the transverse tarsal joint.
Just real quick, the mid-tarsal break is a flexible joint in the middle of the foot. Humans mostly lost this feature, but apes and possibly Sasquatch retain it, allowing more powerful pushing off in uneven terrain. Back to the episode.
That joint is present in humans and in non-human primates, but in non-human primates, it exhibits a much greater range of motion. So we describe their feet as flat, flexible feet. And this affords them an adaptation for climbing up vertical supports. So if you've ever seen a chimpanzee go up a pole, that big, robust, big toe opposes the long, curved lateral digits in a pincher grip. And then while that grip is maintained, the foot can still act as a lever by flexing across the instep such that the heel segment, the hind foot, can move and push the center of mass up through the ankle, from the ankle upward, and the animal climbs upward by displacing its center of mass upward.
It's almost like they have 4 hands rather than 2 hands and feet, right?
Yeah. In fact, when the adaptation is extreme, as in an orangutan, we call it, instead of quadrupedal, it's quadrumanous, manus meaning the hand, like manual versus pedal, the foot. And so you're right, absolutely. And so that's one of the things that the terrestrial hominins have lost early on, was that divergence of that big toe. And this has confused some people because they think, well, the only reason to lose that divergent big toe is if it were incorporated into a longitudinal arch. Well, the arch doesn't appear until much, much later, and it's not full blown, as in modern humans, until the modern human lightening of the skeleton and musculature appears. The earliest evidence of Homo sapiens has now been pushed back to about 300,000. Now, the immediate predecessor, that's still kind of a wastebasket taxon, Homo heidelbergensis, which takes in species, Afro-Asian species spanning, the whole old world. But it already had, I had the opportunity to look at a late specimen that was located outside of Beijing, the Laishu specimen. And it has the remarkable condition of preserving almost the complete foot skeletons. And so it gives us a real exceptional snapshot of pedal foot evolution at that stage. And it was that specimen is actually quite young, thought to be dated, at least preliminarily, somewhere between 12 and 20,000 years ago. Very possible. I mean, they were clearly around contemporaneously with modern Homo sapiens. But these were big, robust, heavy muscled, heavy boned. But they did have an arch. It was a low arch. They still had a fairly long heel segment and a broad foot because of the robusticity of the musculoskeletal system. But this was the common ancestor for us and the Neanderthals and Denisovans, which spread from Europe all the way to East Asia and Southeast Asia. And they also show an arched foot. So Neanderthals had an arched foot, but they have a very distinctive looking foot, very robust, very broad, splayed foot with a relatively longer heel segment on average.
So what I'm hearing, I just want to make sure I'm understanding. So through evolution, the farther back you go in time, our foots are broader, they're flatter from what I'm understanding, and as we've evolved, they've gotten thinner, and I guess you could say more agile, more arch, more flex. So where does the Sasquatch prints that you have studied, where do they fall in that range? I mean, from what I've seen, they're broader and flatter. Is that correct?
Yes. So they are even broader than what we were talking about with some of these early pre-modern human hominins because of their massive body size. So an animal that's upwards, the males upwards of 1,200 pounds, they of necessity have greater breadth to length ratios of the foot because the tissues, they only have so much limits and so much tolerance to the weight bearing demands. And, as when you increase linear dimensions, so as a creature gets bigger, gets taller, its mass, its volume is increasing to the cube of those linear dimensions, whereas the surface area, like on the sole of the foot, is only increasing to the square. So it never works quite right. It's like examples of pituitary giants in humans. Their bodies just aren't designed to be that big. You've just taken a design that's been selected for a size range between 5 and 6 feet, and you've stretched it up to 7, 8, 9 feet, and without any modifications for that increased size. And as a result, the tissues don't tolerate those stresses, and they, knees break down, arches collapse, and then even the organs have problems maintaining the homeostasis in a body that size. It's the simple, the explanation why mice aren't the size of an elephant, and a creature the size of an elephant looks like an elephant rather than a mouse, because it has to have those changes in order to be a big animal like that. So Sasquatch isn't just a big person. It isn't just a wild giant human, because it has to show adaptations for its increased body size. And in the foot, we see that in greater breadth. We see that in a flat archless foot, so that weight isn't concentrated in localized areas beneath the heel and the ball, but rather is spread out over the whole plantar surface, the sole of the foot. And there are other aspects. The toes are smaller, shorter than a gorilla or chimp, but they're not quite as short as humans because they don't toe off the same way. So you can adapt anatomically, but you can also adapt behaviorally. And so one of the things that many eyewitnesses have noted about Sasquatch when they walk, they said it looks so strange because instead of the expected head bobbing, which we see in humans because we walk with an extended limb, heel strike, and then that rather extended straight leg acts like a pole vault over the top of that to maximize our step length. The compliant gait with a walking on flexed knees and hips, the foot, instead of a distinctive heel strike, the foot coming down pretty much flat on the foot. If we look at the footprint casts that have been documented from that site, they don't have the differential impression of a heel strike and a toe off through the big toe and the ball. Instead, in some of them are flat as boards. In fact, this was part of the problem when Roger Patterson selected a right and a left as representative footprints to make casts of. He picked the cleanest, crispest, flattest examples that, the least disturbed that he could find. And as a result, the experts look at these and go, oh, these look like they're made out of carved wooden planks, or left by something made out of a carved wooden plank. They're flat and featureless. They don't look natural. Well, there were lots of them that had more topography, that had more dynamic features, that showed evidence of that midfoot flexibility, which you can actually see in the film. So you can watch, my interpretation of this resulting mid-tarsal pressure ridge, which sometimes is an artifact that's the result of the mid-tarsal break. In other words, the foot steps on the ground, the heel is elevated, as the calf musculature contracts, and then the push-off now is coming from the entire forefoot, not just through the toes. That's what affords a bit longer toe, more prehensile capability in the Sasquatch foot than the human. And sometimes, if the substrate texture is appropriate and there's the sufficient impulse, forward impulse, it'll push back a pressure release ridge or disc from behind that mid-tarsal break towards the heel. And, my interpretation of that has been questioned. First of all, we find signs of it in some of the early hominins, like the Laetoli tracks from Tanzania of Lucy's ilk, the Australopithecus afarensis. They walked on flat, flexible feet, and some of their footprints show evidence of a mid-tarsal pressure ridge, just like that I've described for Sasquatch. But when my interpretation was challenged, all I had to do was say, well, watch the film. The action that I've just described, you can see portrayed in the film right there before your eyes. So it's not like I'm hypothesizing anymore. I'm just describing the associated behavior that correlates with the dynamic trace of the footprint evidence. So it's a retention of a primitive trait. It's the way early bipedal hominins walked for, probably 5 million years or more. And so it's absolutely to be expected with Sasquatch, with then modifications as a result of their immense body mass, their huge size. Patty probably stood just under 8 feet, or I'm sorry, just under 7 feet, and weighed just over 700 pounds. Her anatomy is consistent with that kind of body mass. We have examples of slightly larger footprints, from 2 to 3 inches longer, that probably represent males, and they're relatively broader foot length. And those males probably stand 8.5 feet tall and, are in the neighborhood of 1,200 to 1,400 pounds. That's the size of a moose. If you stop for a minute and contemplate a moose stepping out of the reeds there in Yellowstone, I've experienced them many times. I'm always impressed. One of the favorite things I do at the fairgrounds when the Eastern Idaho Fair is I love to go to the animal shows and see the draft horses. Yeah, enormous. And a Sasquatch weighs in the same ballpark.
What do you think it would take for a bipedal primate to survive undetected for this long in a continent like North America?
Well, the point is, they aren't undetected, and people do see them. I had this very conversation on another show where I was being interviewed, and the caller was kind of taking me to task, and he was drawing attention to the work of Elizabeth Loftus.
Here, Dr. Meldrum is referring to Elizabeth Loftus, a renowned psychologist who studied the fallibility of human memory, especially eyewitness accounts. He's bringing her up to highlight how memory can complicate reports of Sasquatch encounters.
He's saying on that basis, one has to reject all of these eyewitness testimonies. They're unreliable. And I said, well, I think you're comparing apples to oranges. I said, it's one thing, I actually made a little cartoon where I had this little old lady standing in front of a police lineup with a series of silhouettes of the potential, suspects. And she's trying to pick out one from the other. And then on the flip side is an outdoorsman standing there, and the lineup consists of an elk, a deer, a bear, a Bigfoot, and a backpacker. I said, it's, we're comparing apples to oranges, and he was getting more and more frustrated. Well, I acknowledge the reconstructive nature of memory and its malleability, but there's also a growing body of literature. The pendulum is swinging back the other way, where it's being acknowledged that actually memory and recall is quite good, and under the appropriate circumstances, it's very reliable. I mean, that's how we've survived, remembering where the fruiting trees were located, or where the animals tend to go to water, or where the game trails are, where we can set our snares and so forth. The ability to recall that information has been selected strongly. And he got frustrated, and he said, if there was an 800-pound gorilla out in the woods, people would be seen. And I paused and I said, well, that's where we started this conversation, wasn't it? People are seeing it, but you're throwing it out just a priori as unreliable. But that's just it. You can't have your cake and eat it too. So, but you make a good point. Relatively speaking, most encounters are purely by chance. There are very few instances where people have intentionally gone out with the express goal of having an encounter with the Sasquatch. Those that claim that they do that successfully and on a regular basis, that does raise serious red flags and concerns for me, because of the nature of this very solitary, far-ranging, very generalized, elusive creature that is intelligent, but I don't think, intelligent on par with, say, a gorilla or a chimpanzee. But I don't think, and I always point this out to people when they say, oh, well, they must be really smart. They must be like almost human intelligence to be able to avoid people. And I said, every time you see a buck that has avoided being shot season after season after season, Are you going to invoke that they must be as smart as my neighbor, or as my because they.
Well, not only that, I know with like mountain lions, panthers, a lot of the cat family, you can be out in the jungle of the Amazon or wherever they may be, and you will not see them because they don't want to be seen. And it's very rare that you'll see a creature like that. So it makes complete sense to me that if this ape is even not intelligent as us, but just like weary of humans, that it could 100% stay hidden.
And you're in their home, not the other way around. They know they're in their element. You're an interloper. No matter how much you frequent the out of doors, you still are not on par with an animal that makes its living under those circumstances. And so that part doesn't concern me. Where are the bones? Well, there are lots of things that are being discovered every day, it seems, or frequently, and when you consider the rarity, the longevity, I think it's reasonable. We have some indirect evidence from repeat appearances of recognizably distinct individuals based on their footprints that span decades. And if we can analogize within the group, the superfamily Hominoidea, the great apes and humans all live to be about the same. We've extended our life expectancy here recently because of the Industrial Revolution, because of our increased standard of living and medical care and nutrition and so forth. But it's like I tell my students in my anatomy and physiology courses that I was describing earlier, the factory warranties run out at about age 45. And after that, you're on borrowed time. And everything starts to go downhill.
Is there any evidence of primates burying their dead?
No.
Other than us?
No, there's not.
There's not.
The forest generally just takes care of its detritus very efficiently and rapidly. So yeah, there's no evidence of that. And especially because the evidence, the few clues we have, that is encounters and footprint finds, all seem to point to solitary individuals or a female with some dependent offspring. A non-social, a solitary animal like that, it seems even more unlikely that they're burying their dead. That seems to be a very recent, even, I think erroneously, that behavior's been attributed, say, to Neanderthals. It's just that they occupied caves. And in the wintertime, if there's 12 of you living inside of a cave under kind of conditions, and it's not desirable to go venturing out frequently, when someone dies, what do? You push them into a crevice and put some dirt over them, if not carry them out and let them freeze outside. But even this Homo naledi attributed burial behavior, intentional behavior, to this hominin that has a brain the size of a chimpanzee. I think it's just ludicrous. The place that they're found is so out of the way. Evidence points to it being waterborne, and the evidence of fire and the evidence of scrapings on the ceiling. It's so ambiguous and so tentative that I think it's just a bit more sensationalism than anything. The first evidence we really have of burial is Homo sapiens. So I think it very unlikely and unnecessary.
Can I ask about another Sasquatch bit of evidence or footage put out there has had some good discussion around it? It's the Sierra sounds, so the vocalizations that were recorded. What's your take on that?
For those of you that don't know, the Sierra sounds are audio recordings captured in the early 1970s by Ron Moorhead and Al Berry in a remote hunting camp in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California. The men reported strange vocalizations outside their camp at night and decided to record them. What they captured has become some of the most debated audio evidence in Sasquatch research. A mix of whoop, howls, whistles, and what almost sounds like rapid-fire speech. Some researchers have argued the recordings reveal vocal ranges and structures outside that of known humans, while skeptics have dismissed them as hoaxes or misidentified animal calls. The Sierra sounds remain controversial. But for many in the Bigfoot community, they stand alongside footprint casts and the Patterson Gimlin film as one of the most compelling pieces of potential evidence. Here's what they sound like.
There's two of them across the creek at the big rocks. It's a hard act to follow.
He sounds like he talks to others and they talk to each other.
Yeah.
Well, I've always been extremely intrigued by them, and one of the qualities that caught my interest very early on was there's an exchange where the men inside the wiki up are whistling, and there's a response. But the response you hear, where the men are whistling through their teeth, through their lips, not just a regular whistle, but the athletic kind of whistling, I guess you'd call it. What the term that would be, the one that I can't do. But in any case, when the Sasquatch seemingly responds, there's this interesting attempt at mimicking it. It obviously doesn't sound the same, and it sounds like it's not whistling through its mouth or its teeth, but rather from its throat. And there's actually a harmonic, an overtone that would suggest that it's modulating its pharynx in such a way, like a bird. A bird can whistle, but a bird doesn't have lips. It has a rudimentary tongue, maybe, but there's no lips. There's nothing else and so the whistling is occurring in the syrinx, the structures in the throat that surround the union, like our larynx, the union between the trachea and esophagus. So it's interesting. That always gave me or made me very curious about it. I know Ron Moorhead very well. Kept him as a friend and heard him speak. I don't agree with all the things that he has hypothesized. His quantum Sasquatch is a bit. I just can't rationalize that. Nor do I think it necessary to account for the reported behaviors and observations of anatomy and so forth. Likewise, the work of Scott Nelson, the cryptolinguist, are fascinating. And he has actually toned down some of his assertions because at the last time I heard him speak, oftentimes at these conferences, if I'm on the program, I don't have the wherewithal because I have to man a table and to interact with the patrons of the event, and so I don't always get a chance to hear the talks. But on one occasion, he actually did kind of back off, and he said he's not saying that they have language. Their communications, their vocalizations may be a form of communication, but not necessarily a full syntax, language with syntax like or equivalent to that employed by Homo sapiens, which I thought was an important caveat, because in the past, he's overstated their linguistic abilities and the gibberish and chatter. What seems like exchanges, meaningful exchanges, may indeed be meaningful, but may not be language as we define human language. The other thing that gives me pause, and this I don't say lightly because I am so fascinated by the Sierra Sounds. But for me, in every instance, the footprints, if there are footprints to be seen, that's the litmus test. Unfortunately, the footprints that have been publicized associated with these experiences up there are very odd. They're very unnatural in appearance. They're very wedge-shaped. They look almost like a swim fin with what some have called sausage toes because they're so uniform and cylindrical across the end of the foot in such a way you can't tell if you're looking at a right or a left foot. There's no asymmetry. That really gives me some concern. Now, Ron has said that there are other footprints, and then also, add to that oddness of the footprints the paranormal. Initially, the paranormal aspects, the orbs and other high strangeness, as the term is applied, were always kind of on the down low. They weren't emphasized in the descriptions, but of late it's become more fashionable, if you will, to dally in the arena of paranormal, and so they've been getting more airtime.
I wonder why that is, because you think about that, like, Sasquatch, we have Gigantopithecus and other species that we've talked about that are just as fascinating as Sasquatch is, and we've documented that those are real. We have I think we have bones and things like that, right? So it's so funny that and then you also have on another hand, you have pretty recently there's been species of there was a snakehead fish that was recently discovered that they thought was extinct for 40 years, and that was it. The Tasmanian tiger, I believe, is another one that I believe they've seen, or there's some evidence of. So you have all these evidence of other species that have been, hiding, so to speak, for 40 years, but somehow you have to commit this paranormal woo stuff to Sasquatch, and I just don't understand why that is.
Well, and definitely the case for cryptozoology, for the existence of cryptids, hidden species, can be made. I think unfortunately, even in that arena, when the net gets cast so broadly that you're bringing in fairies and werewolves, dogmen, and all sorts of other phenomenon, then it becomes it dilutes the rational evidence and arguments that can be made for a biological species. And that's why I literally shun that participation. It's fascinating. I shouldn't say shun. I guess I don't entertain it in the same way. I try to remain open-minded, but it's, mistakes me, but it's that old hamburger commercial. Where's the beef? You gotta have a beef patty between the buns, and so far all I've seen are buns.
Yeah.
And there's no beef. And when I press the issue home in some instances, it just falls apart. It becomes all too clear that there is no footprint evidence for dogmen. Period. There is no footprint evidence for dogmen.
Do you have other scientists and other people in your field that maybe privately come to you and say, Jeff, I believe you. I think that there's something to this, but they won't, come out publicly and say it because they're ashamed?
Well, yes and no. Yeah, but let me just qualify some of your word choice. Most scientists are reluctant to or resistant to use the word believe because it carries such a connotation. And the ideological skeptics, the trolls out there, love to use the term true believer as someone who has abandoned objectivity and rationalism and instead holds to a conviction that's basically emotionally based. It's just a curiosity and interest but it's not an informed, educated, objective, critical position stance. And so that's that. And then the word ashamed, I think it's not that so much as it's caution. They're cautionary because, or cautious. They take a cautionary stance because they've seen what I've endured and what Dr. Krantz has endured and others who have, Dr. Bindernagel. Yes, though, to your question, there are people that I interact with. Here's just one illustration, case in point, an anonymous. But every once in a while, I'm successful in getting an abstract accepted to the physical anthropology meetings, my flagship organization. Now it's biological anthropology, American Association of Biological Anthropologists, name change. But I remember one time, and I learned quickly not to do a podium presentation because I would leave time for questions. And while the presentations were always well attended, it's not like they boycotted, Meldrum's Bigfoot talk. It was a standing room only. But when it came time, when I opened the floor to questions, it was crickets. No one dared ask a question. And so I decided to just do poster presentations where people could have a little more intimate interaction. And of course, they were well attended. And then you've got, instead of just 10 minutes, you've got 4.5 hours to interact with people. And it was nonstop every time. And at one point, on this one occasion, this gentleman, he was, I didn't recognize him. He was a more senior scientist, but I think he was a cultural anthropologist or social anthropologist, I think, but more than a biological anthropologist. But in any case, he leans over to me and he said, "I'm so glad to see someone finally doing this. I'm glad it's not me, but I'm glad someone's doing it." And that just epitomized the attitude, the concern.
Yeah.
Now, I've had more and more. Well, one of the things, and here's an opportunity for me to plug the Relic Hominoid Inquiry. I established an online, registered, peer-reviewed journal back about almost 14 years ago now. It is an open access journal that provides a venue for scholarly writing, whether it's primary research articles or in-depth book reviews or news, commentaries, archival materials, translations of foreign papers, so forth. I don't do it alone. I have an editorial board of about a dozen PhDs or professionals of other skill sets. We have representation of a citizen scientist on our panel too, and are encouraging a special topic or category of submission from the citizen scientist who doesn't necessarily have the accolades behind their name, the PhD and so forth. But the point being is I interact with a lot of people, and I interact with lots of potential reviewers and commentators, and have had very, very positive interactions. Just a couple of not rejections, but so-and-so. Well, there was one person, I can think of one person who never responded to repeated email attempts to contact him. I had one person who demurred because they said they had a stack of like 3 or 4 reviews they had to get done before the end of the month, and they couldn't possibly take on another manuscript to review. He said, but it looked really interesting. I've always gotten very positive feedback from reviewers, and even if they're critical or not entirely approving of the merits or quality of the paper. So yes, there is interaction. The sad thing has been, the very disappointing thing has been, a number of very prominent scholars, like I mentioned, John Bindernagel, Grover Krantz, Dryas Swindler, a primatologist, University of Washington, just as they enter retirement, and they're now in a position to take a more active role, with no more encumbrances, unfortunately, they get taken from us. So I guess the motto for me is not to retire. Just keep going. Because
well, you really struck a chord there with me, because starting this podcast, I really set out to be skeptical, and hearing some experiencer stories of across the whole gambit from UFO to ghost to cryptid to what have you,
Right.
it really has played on my emotions a little bit, where you look in these people's eyes and you have so much empathy for what they've experienced, real or not. It's real to them. As a counterpoint to that, one of my areas of study is artificial intelligence. I'm really trying to contribute to that field. That's something I believe in, and quantum computing a little bit too. So what I had this idea that I'm going to build myself an AI. I use OpenAI or ChatGPT's infrastructure, and I've built a custom GPT that we call Scully, which is a play off of the X-Files. And I've programmed her to keep me honest, to keep me skeptical, and to bring science and only science. And when we hear some of these stories, I'll feed the transcript to her, and I'll be able to ask her questions, which has been a really cool little thing that we've been doing lately. Because again, I really want to stay scientific and skeptical. And I guess a question I have relating to that is, what kind of evidence do you think that we're going to see next with Sasquatch? And I guess also, do you think that AI and maybe quantum computing could help in that way? Like, could AI help us find more evidence and bring more science into this realm?
I think so. I think I've been fielding that question in a particular way for a couple of years now, and things have continued to change. But I think that to advance this beyond the almost stereotypical way in which Bigfoot research is conducted in the field, going out looking through night vision or through thermal imaging, most often at night, it seems, which I don't think is the best or should not be an exclusive strategy, and so forth. But I think, or call blasting, wood knocking, all these supposed tried and true, but unsuccessful methods, at least not conclusively successful. I think there are two directions, and I would add now a third that you've mentioned, because this has repeatedly come up. But the first two would be either one, the applications of aerial reconnaissance combined with ever improving or more accessible, the improvement's probably there, but the penetrating thermal imaging, or alternately LiDAR with sufficient resolution combined with the penetrance of LiDAR to differentiate individual creatures, like of considerable size, like we were talking about earlier, on the range of 700 to 1,500 pounds. So you could, in other words, tell the difference between a moose and a bear and a Bigfoot based on the signature of the profile or the thermal, signature, the characteristics of a thermal image. So that's one. And as drones, right now the limitation on multi-copter powered drones versus, even fixed wing drones. I mean, there's some place where that could be a way, and that would increase the reach and duration over a multi-copter drone. But also then you've got the limitations of the battery power of the instrumentation. So that's one. And I had, and it's been a while now, I haven't followed up lately with technicians in this field of LiDAR, but was assured that the time was not far off when that degree of resolution and differentiation would be possible. So I think that's one. The other is ability to cast a net more broadly in order to gather DNA evidence, because you've got this moving needle in a haystack, and interacting with that moving needle is pretty dodgy. But if that needle is leaving bits of its DNA throughout the haystack, you just have to sample. But then it's the question of, can you differentiate the DNA from that rare and elusive entity? If this creature exists and it is within the hominoid family tree, it may be very easily, if it's a hominid or a hominin rather, if it's on our side of the split with common ancestors to the known and extinct great apes versus the bipedal hominins. And there's more and more evidence that bipedalism isn't exclusively an adaptation, a derived adaptation of the hominins, but there may have been some Miocene apes that, like Oreopithecus and Danuvius, and there's several different genera that have species that have more generalized pelvies and feet and so forth, that bipedalism wasn't facultative bipedalism, at least, if not habitual bipedalism. It may be that habitual bipedalism is the an exclusive derived trait of the hominin family tree, in which case Sasquatch could be more closely related to us than any other living creature. And as near as, say, chimps are, with DNA that's 94 to 96% identical, maybe a Sasquatch is 99% identical. And so unless a very thorough analysis is carried out, and isn't it interesting that on those rare occasions we have hair samples, and unfortunately one of the characteristics that seems to be distinctive of the Sasquatch hair is the lack of a cellular medulla. Not a mysterious feature, but it's rare and unusual, especially in its consistency across all the color spectrum, from almost white up through mahogany black. The lack of the cellular medulla means there's precious little DNA in the hair shaft. So unless you have an actively dividing follicle, or a hair that's been torn out from the follicle with a little skin tag attached to it, there's not going to be much in the way of DNA in a regular hair shaft. And so what's the result? On those rare instances when they do get DNA, invariably the result is human. And it's argued that they're either contaminated from mishandling by the witness or someone along the chain of custody, or two, it's simply a human hair that's been misattributed to a Sasquatch. Hair is very persistent in the environment. It's very durable tissue. Keratin, holds up in the environment quite well. The third possibility might be that you just haven't sequenced enough to stumble on those rare markers that would distinguish a Sasquatch from us.
Yeah, I wonder if like CRISPR or like a gene editing. I know that's gene editing, which is not exactly what we're talking about, but I wonder if a tool like that, maybe combined with AI, can help us get a little bit closer to that, to kind of fill in the gaps of the DNA, to make us understand it.
And that might be, but I think before the problem with those applications, is you really need to have a known sample that you establish the baseline for comparison with everything else. And so short of that, I don't know these technologies well enough to envision how. Now, there's been suggestions, and this brings up a third prong. There's been suggestions made by several people that, building on some of the interesting insights we've gained about anecdotal report data through GIS analysis of distribution patterns and correlations, that AI may help to process in new ways, novel ways, information that might be embedded in some of that anecdotal data bases. I mean, there's been some really interesting things that have been done. There was a paper, an editorial, that was admonishing the users of ecological modeling software not to rely unwittingly on the outputs of these algorithms, that you need to know what treatments you're subjecting your data to, not just, use it like a magic black box. And so to demonstrate the potential pitfalls, they set out to test some ostensibly bogus data. Namely, they used Sasquatch data. And one of the individuals had a history with the subject matter, and he'd been a student at the University of Colorado and actually did his honors thesis on a Sasquatch-related question of geospatial data analysis. And but what they came up with was this remarkably a solid demonstration of a remarkable correlation between black bear habitat parameters and the distribution patterns of Sasquatch data. So much so that they opined in their conclusions that, it's possible that two species could have such similar bioclimatic factors determining their habitat. But it seems much more likely that, given the correlation, that herein we have an explanation for Sasquatch encounters. They're simply misidentified bear encounters. And, I got in touch with the one author, and I said, what gives? I thought you were sympathetic to this prospect. And he goes, Jeff, you should realize more than anyone, given your experiences, had we even hinted at the possibility in our manuscript that this data actually lent some credible support to the question of Sasquatch existence, the paper wouldn't have gotten published. So we had to adopt a kind of tongue-in-cheek posture and, pander to our reviewers.
That's so frustrating.
And he said, he said, but I'll have you know, this was the punchline. I'll have you know, my two co-authors who entered into this project, absolutely skeptical of Sasquatch, after seeing the results, they're asking me all kinds of questions. They're really intrigued. I have them both reading your book. So anyway, I'm thinking, again, I don't understand these technologies and how they work exactly, but it would just seem that building on that kind of analysis, that AI might be able to be employed in trying to analyze, the hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of reports that have come in and continue to come in. And, there's a lot of chaff. It's messy data. It's not coming from disciplined, objective observers, but people who are enthusiasts, and that word carries some cautionary baggage.
Yeah.
Hypothetically, if someone brought you a Sasquatch tomorrow, living or dead, what would be the first test you'd want to run on it?
Well, I guess given my expertise, I'd want to do some quick radiographic analysis of the foot and ankle, for one thing, to verify the hypothesis, the observation and description of that central characteristic of the Sasquatch foot, the mid-tarsal break. I mean, that's sort of the key to the description. I undertook the ichnotaxonomy of the Sasquatch footprint. There's a parallel Linnaean system of classification for typically fossilized tracks and traces, for those instances where said tracks and traces are not directly correlated with track maker or trace maker. In other words, the extinct species of that footprint hasn't been identified. But in order to attach a description and an accepted, reviewed and published diagnosis of the footprint, so that there's a handle that it can be discussed and talked about and later attributed to a species, this system exists. And so, with encouragement from the movers and shakers in that discipline that I have only kind of peripheral involvement with, we applied that nomenclature to the Sasquatch footprints, and in so doing established a description and codified this mid-tarsal break as a central element of the foot morphology and the distinguishing characteristics. So that would be a real important thing, is to actually be able to confirm that ichnotaxon in association with the establishment of a nomen for the species itself. But then, I would certainly be interested in the dental morphology and so forth, establishing that, because obviously eventually fossil evidence of teeth from cave deposit and so forth is going to be forthcoming, and having that established would be very useful and helpful in that regard. But then we'd, of course, would want to have molecular geneticist. I haven't done any DNA sequencing for decades, and would want to collaborate with those people who are doing that work now on the cutting edge, do a genomic sequence and characterize the genetics. We'd want to do karyotypes as well, and staining, and get an understanding of the chromosomal morphology as well, because that might be where some of the difference is located. Even though a chimpanzee is 96% identical to human in sequence, there are some major fusions and inversions and translocations and chromosomal rearrangements that have had tremendous impact on the phenotypes of humans and chimpanzees. And so, culturing some cells, if that was still possible, if it was an early demise, a recent demise, that would be significant. Those kind of things would be what I would be looking for. But it would be document.
If you could build a dream research team across any discipline to help you essentially locate a Sasquatch and prove the existence of one, who's on it?
Well, yeah, I've grappled with that very kind of question, because we have had a couple of opportunities, one that was realized and a couple that never quite materialized, that afforded us the means, the wherewithal to try to do that a little bit. I had the privilege of working with someone in the field who was remarkably talented as a wildlife biologist and ethnobotanist, as well as just avocational cultural anthropologist, I guess you could say. That's John Myanzinski. And we spent a lot of time in the field, in the backcountry, doing all kinds of things, testing equipment at the time that was kind of cutting edge. Technology advances so rapidly that it's hard to keep up with things. You invest in equipment, and before you can get it out of the box, it's obsolete almost. I mean, the problem has been is that in spite of all those toys, if you will, or that instrumentation, the equipment, the means, as I described earlier, you're searching for the proverbial moving needle in a haystack. And so there has been so many encounters that are, nearly all encounters, like I said, that are purely happenstance. I mean, I've had the good fortune of finding footprints in the field on a half a dozen occasions that are quite convincing, and some in extremely remote areas. Very unlikely that any hoaxer or prank activity could have taken place. But it's hard to get around that rarity factor, the elusivity. And so that's why the two strategies that I've described permit the reach to be extended or the net to be expanded, whether it's through aerial survey, when we get to the point where you can survey. And maybe, I've had people say, Jeff, if we could ask a military grade spy satellite, and they, because, we were discussing this challenge of the penetrance of the canopy. It's not like the military movies you see where they fly the drones over the deserts of Iraq and they can pick out individual terrorists. I mean, we're talking about, it's more like when you have the night vision on a police helicopter and the perp is running across a parking lot, but then ducks into the city park and disappears because you can't see through the treetops or the brush or, the bushes. But I've been told, Jeff, if we flew this over your house on Saturday morning, I could tell you what brand of cornflakes you were eating.
Oh, jeez.
I'm like, okay. I don't know if that makes me feel
that makes me feel uncomfortable. I don't know. It sounds like you lean more towards like technology rather than, a dream team of, Joe Rogan and, I don't know who else.
Well, we've talked with, ex-Navy SEALs and and special ops, these people who are supposed to be able to go in, get the target and get out type of thing.
Like trackers and things like that. Yeah.
Right. Well, and I've dealt with man trackers and animal trackers. But again, and that was what I have a standing understanding with one individual who, if I come upon a line of tracks, to get him there as quickly as possible, and he'll track it to its end. It sounds great, but then the first requirement is pretty high, pretty stiff, because it's rare to find footprints. You got a rare animal, even though it's a moose. It's like you said. The elusivity of a moose. One time I remember I was up the Olympic Peninsula in the Olympic Forest, and we were kind of scouting around and just poking around. But we were in a clear cut. There were about 12 head of moose, antlered bulls over there. All of a sudden they decided we were too close, and they took off into the woods. And I thought, well, I just really want to see it. An animal that size. I want to see the trail. This cluster, 12 leaves left. We found a few hoof prints, just a couple here and there, but there was no, thoroughfare. There were no torn limbs or branches or lots of needles knocked off. They just lean their head back, and that rat goes slipping through with the grain of the, doesn't get snagged. And they're like ghosts. They hardly leave a trace. And so it doesn't surprise me. And that's with sharp hooves and, well-defined appendages and antlers. And so you have an animal that has a soft padded sole pad that doesn't have claws, that doesn't have sharp hooves. And so even, unless you've got the best of conditions, mud or road dust, or there just isn't a lot of space out there to get the footprints. So, yeah. So then what do you do with your special ops team? Where do you deploy them? How long do they stay in one spot? At one time we were getting ready. One of the fellows I worked with had very deep pockets. He was a retired executive with a major investment company, and he's always had the bug growing up. But he finally had the notion, I'm going to do this. And so he reached out to me as in sort of a consulting capacity, and had the good fortune I got to work with him in the field. It was a lot of fun. We did a lot of interesting things, tried a lot of new techniques and so forth. But one time he wanted me to choose a location. This was part of the problem, is he was like a butterfly. He would flip from one blossom to the next. And I kept saying, we've got to settle on one region, have a rationale, and then work it. Network with the local. We got to multiply our eyes and hands by networking with local agency and local people and law enforcement and so forth. And then, really focus on it. He would react to reports or to experiences of habituation claims, which I have never had positive experience with or seen bear out under close scrutiny. They've always been overly imaginative people who interpret very equivocal experiences as by attributing them to Sasquatch, and have no good solid evidence, and nothing for us to follow up on when we go there. But anyway, so he had me pick a spot in Idaho. So I'm put on the, put in the hot seat. But I tried to use a real sensible approach, looking at the habitat, looking at the potential for tracking, et cetera, et cetera. But to make a long story short, he picks me up and he turns to me and he said, now remember the numbers I was talking about, how many I think are out there. They're very rare. They're very, very rare. I put it at about 200 black bear for every one Sasquatch. So building on that remarkable demonstration of correlation between black bear habitat and Sasquatch distribution data, makes sense. Two large omnivore species would have similar bioclimatic requirements, but there are differences in their natural history, differences in their lifespan, in their reproduction rates, and so forth. and in other aspects of their, say, gut physiology, their digestion, their mastication, and so forth, that would partition resources, partition strategies, and population densities supported by that habitat. Anyway, in all of Idaho, we have about 35,000 black bear at a ratio of 200 to 1. That's 175 Sasquatch in the entire state. So I picked out an area, and this area, one of the draws, one of the features was the Big Sandy Creek, which when you looked from Google Earth was this meandering creek in this floodplain that had tons and tons of exposed sandbars. And so not only did the meandering creek afford lots of resources, but that the exposed sandbars present more surface area to potentially find tracks to confirm the potential presence of something worth spending our time, devoting our time. But when this gentleman picks me up, we decided to just take the one vehicle. Usually we have multiple, but for this one we were kind of conserving. It was a preliminary scout trip. And anyway, he turns to me, "What do you think, Jeff? What are our odds?" And I just kind of laughed and I said, "Well,
Not great.
pull over at this KB Quick Stop up here and let's buy a few scratch cards and I'll talk to you about our odds."
Yeah.
I said, "We can have all of our ducks in a row. We can have all the equipment function to its specification, no batteries inexplicably dying, whatever. We can do all of the things that we're supposed to do. And if there isn't a Sasquatch, possibly a single Sasquatch, in that drainage that I've picked out, because we're only going up there for like 10 days, just a short jaunt, in those 10 days, we're SOL. It could be just over the ridge in the next drainage, but we won't know because we're not going over there. We don't have the time or the means to get over there and thoroughly investigate it. Because, we were just basically boots on the ground. We didn't have means for exhaustive aerial survey or other tools in our bag of tricks. And so I said, it's like if you don't buy a ticket, you'll never win. The more tickets, more scratch cards you buy, the better your chances are of winning. But it's about on the same odds, if not worse.
Yeah, I mean, speaking about all of these tools, what do you think about what they found using the LiDAR underneath the Pyramid of Giza in Egypt?
I don't have the expertise archaeologically or geologically to critique or evaluate those arguments. So I find them interesting, and I certainly have looked at and read a little bit about some of that, especially with all the renewed interest in the subterranean structures that supposedly exist underneath the pyramids now. That it's all fascinating, and whether it bears up under scrutiny or not. And there are some parallels. I mean, all fields of science have experienced periods of entrenched dogma that has stifled novel thinking. And in anthropology, for example, when the Patterson Gimlin film came out, I often wondered, why was there such a visceral rejection? Why was there this reaction? Irrational in some of the things that were said. Well, when you look at it against the backdrop of what the prevailing consensus was at the time, in the 60s, there was a new theory in anthropology that had been largely influenced by the niche hypothesis in ecology, which in turn borrowed it from microbiology, which was where it was called the competitive exclusion principle, that no two species could occupy the same niche. One would always be better making a living there than the other, and ultimately drive the other to extinction, or drive it to partition the niche, or what we call character displacement, strong selection for a different expression of that characteristic, different variation of that feature. Well, at that time in the 60s, as the fossil evidence of hominins tended to be lined up in a straight line, and this single file march. I alluded to this bushy, busy tree that didn't appear until later in the 70s. that notion, once the single species hypothesis that the hominin niche was an exclusive club and there could be only one member in it, defined by bipedalism, big brains, and enlarging brains, and material culture, the possession of material culture. Well, now, and so against that backdrop, we're the bipedal hominin. So how do you accommodate a Sasquatch or a Yeti or a Russian Almaz or a Yowie? They can't exist. And so literally, this was thrown in my face. A paper that was rejected, when pressed for a rationale for the rejection, she said, they can't exist, therefore they don't exist, and it doesn't matter what evidence they think they have. Real scientific attitude, right?
Yeah, right.
Well, now that paradigm has shifted, and there isn't a term really. I just use the term the persistent multi-species hypothesis, that we have a bushy tree. It turns out there are different ways to be a bipedal hominin, and there were contemporaneous species across the board at different slices of time through the past. And in fact, there's evidence now of many of these lineages persisting until just tens of thousands of years ago, which would have been inconceivable just a few decades ago. So the point being, when I was growing up, another case in point, just to emphasize it for other listeners perhaps, but when I was growing up, the Clovis, that was the oldest, the first and only occupants of North America. The curtain was raised at 1,200 years ago, or 12,000 years ago.
Yeah, 12,000.
And no human occupation existed before. And they would bend over backwards to discredit any claims to the contrary, even though there were all sorts of really interesting and tantalizing suggestions of much earlier occupation, and even far southern locations that were possibly tens of thousands of years older than that, which meant even perhaps earlier initial occupation. And then, of course, the idea of trans-Pacific immigration, and sources from Australia or from other areas, Indonesia. So anyway, the point is that facade eventually crumbled, collapsed under the weight of accumulating evidence. And we saw the same thing happen to the single species hypothesis. So now on this bushy tree, there's lots of branches upon which one might hang a relict hominoid, like a Sasquatch or like a Almasti that might be a relic Neanderthal, or a Hobbit that might be a relic Australopithecine, or the Yowie that could be who knows what, The Yowie's a problem because, again, for me, the litmus test is the footprints. And I can summarize it in one figure where I've made a mosaic composite of about 7 different examples of footprints attributed to the Yowie, and no two are the same. So that just speaks to a muddle of misidentification and hoaxing and who knows what.
The Yowie in Australia is a really interesting one. Like, it's really deeply embedded in our. Do you think there's any credibility to the Yowie as a whole? And if so, why do you think there is reports of aggression more so in that sort of Australian Yowie than there is in others?
The central uneasiness revolves around the biogeographic problem of a hominoid species, a singular existence of a placental hominoid on an island that has been largely isolated. Now, there have been examples of hominins that have made it to the question of whether older individuals, older types of hominins, like Asian Homo erectus or Homo heidelbergensis, might be at the root of some of those stories, and they might be in much more direct competition with humans, and therefore more oral traditions of aggressive behavior, antagonistic interactions. I don't know. You wonder with the remarkable examples of convergent evolution between so many marsupials and placental mammals. I often, when I spend a lot of time on convergence, and because it's interesting how nature solves similar challenges in similar ways, even if from quite disparate starting points. And it's a real testament of natural selection. And so you've got all these guilds that are represented. You've got the canid-like carnivore, the felid-like carnivore, you've got ricochetal, you've got gliding, you've got climbing, you've got digging, you've got, all these things that have remarkably similar. So good and arboreal. I mean, most of the lower primates have convergent representation amongst the possums and gliders, these arboreal, climbing, clinging animals that are very primate-like in that characteristic. But what about a hominoid? What about a large body? Did any, short of a tree wallaby, which doesn't bear a lot of resemblance to a chimpanzee, is there a marsupial that could have evolved convergently to the point that in oral traditions it takes on the aura of an ape, of a hominoid?
All right, Dr. Meldrum, let's, I think I have one final question for you. So what has been the hardest part of pursuing this research as a tenured scientist, and what keeps you in it?
Well, I like to say that I was not entirely naive. I was just idealistic. I was aware of the experiences that, my predecessor, Dr. Grover Krantz, had experienced. So it wasn't like it wasn't as if there wasn't some precedent upon which to appeal to for, a pattern. And, but I thought, quite honestly, Grover had a real reputation of being somewhat of a maverick in many different ways. In many aspects, he was very prescient and actually anticipated things. He was just a decade ahead of his time, and so he was the point of the spear, you might say, and but it drew a lot of ridicule or denigration as a result of that. I thought, well, I'm really well established. I'm mainstream, I'm doing solid research. I published. Who would not take what I had to say seriously?
Right. Yeah.
So that was a little overly enthusiastic. Let's put it that way. And so, no, it's been a real eye opener. And this is the sad commentary for all of our adulation, of the ivory tower of scientific intellectualism. Scientists academia represents a cross-section of humanity that has as much variety as just about any other subset. And as a result, there are personalities, there are prejudices, there's bigotry, there's ego. My experience has exposed an underbelly to the scientific, the institutional machine that is not very complimentary, I have to say, quite frankly. I've resisted the tendency to be jaded or to become too cynical. I always felt bad that it seemed that Dr. Krantz had really gotten cynical. When you read his book, his final chapter on the, quote, scientific establishment, I know exactly what he means by that, what he's referring to. But when in first reading it, I kind of thought, oh, it's too bad that there's so much evidence of just, sour grapes. But I can appreciate and understand. And I have had some very unfortunate experiences with colleagues. I've had some very positive ones, though. I always want to balance the negative with the very positive experiences, I had a journalist who sat across the chair from me here, and she made the point that she had already, I think it was a she, maybe it was a he this time, but that they had already talked to a lot of both students and faculty on campus, and they go, "You're pretty much considered a joke." I just laughed, and I held up my book and I said, well, whose name do you see on the cover there at the bottom under that endorsement? Oh, it's Dr. Jane Goodall. That's right. You know who she is, right? Yeah. Do you know who Dr. George Schaller is? Well, kind of. He's, probably the preeminent naturalist of our century. And I said, he wrote the foreword to the book, and you should read it. And there's a passage on the back of the book. And here in the paperback, the first couple of pages are endorsements from PhDs and professionals of other, state veterinarians, wildlife agents, and so forth. And you talk to who? It's not a Teflon coat, but it deflects a lot of silly, ridiculous, baseless sniping that the journalists sometimes gravitate to, or become privy to, when you hold the credentials, of some instructor in the physics department against the experience of and expertise of Dr. Jane Goodall, who doesn't endorse the existence of Sasquatch, but she endorses the objective consideration of the question of the existence of relic hominoids. She's impressed by the native traditions. Dr. Schaller, he doesn't tout the existence of Bigfoot in his foreword or his comments, but he does praise me for approaching it as a scientist, objectively and with rigor, and marshaled an argument or laid out the evidence. I mean, it's without even attempting to try to persuade, but rather to persuade to a point of view, but rather to persuade regarding the compelling nature of the evidence itself, which speaks for itself if you consider it from an informed position. And that's, I really appreciate that. And that has served my objectives, very, very well. So I have a very thick skin, honestly have very little patience for ignorance at this point. It's been disappointing. I look back once in a while, I wonder what path my career might have taken had I not pursued this line of, but as I was kneeling next to these footprints in 1996, where I was shown, had this rather exceptional opportunity to actually witness in the ground prints that were less than 8 hours old, had this little conversation with the two imps, one on each shoulder. The one saying, look at what happened to France. Look at, his tenure was delayed. His promotion to full professor was delayed. He was ridiculed. He was made fun of. The other one saying, what an amazing set of data you're looking at. How could you walk away from this? I mean, Sasquatch actually walked by here last night.
Crazy.
And so, you can see which imp won the argument, took the day. It's been frustrating. If I have successfully kept the door open so that another generation, if I've been a conduit that has kept the door open and allowed some students coming up, and I have experienced evidence of that. I have interacted with students who have talked to me, approached me, and so forth. One of the most, I've shared this with other people, but we had a visiting assistant professor in anthropology, and she was interested in the anatomy program and our donors, and whether those tissues might be available for her archaeological research. At a lull in the conversation, she said, "Can I ask a geeky question?" I said, "Well, sure. Those are usually the most interesting." She reached in her handbag and pulled out Sasquatch Leisure Meets Science. "And would you sign my book? In fact, would you sign this one for my dad?"
That's awesome.
And she had grown up sharing this fascination with the subject of Sasquatch with her father, and it certainly had influenced her decision to pursue anthropology, but in a very different way, which is a wise decision to follow a line of research that isn't directly and declaratively centered on Bigfoot. But what it pleased me the most about was it was an example of a student from a very prestigious graduate program, but who wasn't indoctrinated, or at least hadn't allowed herself to be indoctrinated by the dogmas of the single species hypothesis, and those who were still laboring under that influence. Like Thomas Kuhn said, it sometimes takes an entire generation to die, to pass away, to clear the way for new ideas to take root and flourish. And we're witnessing that transition. I feel quite strongly we're witnessing that transition. And as this next generation comes up, many of these students have grown up with the documentaries, with access to internet, with all the stories and so forth, that and the cultural icons that make it just part of the landscape.
That was our conversation with Dr. Jeff Meldrum. What stands out to me the most about him is the courage it took to follow the evidence wherever it led, even if it meant facing ridicule from the scientific establishment. Not many people are willing to risk their reputation for the truth, but Dr. Meldrum did. His passing on September 11th, 2025 is a loss that can't really be measured. But what he left behind, the research, the writings, and the inspiration he gave to people who are curious enough to keep asking questions, will continue to shape this mystery long after today. I genuinely hope this conversation leaves you thinking differently, not just about Sasquatch, but about the importance of staying open-minded in the face of the unknown. I think that's going to be Dr. Meldrum's legacy, and I think it's what he'd want. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow the show, leave a review, and share it with someone who loves a good mystery. And if you have your own close encounter, UFO, ghost, cryptid, or something stranger, send your story our way. We'd love to hear it. This episode was produced and edited by Josh Barretto, mixed and mastered by Brett Jarvis. This has been episode 20 with our conversation with Dr. Jeff Meldrum, and you've been listening to the Close Encounter Club. Rest easy, Dr. Meldrum. It was an honor speaking to you.